and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 700, and it is titled A Guide to Schopenhauer by Will Durant, PhD. And this is copyright 1924. This is part 3, and we start off with part 2, the will to reproduce. It can, by the strategy and martyrdom of reproduction. Every normal organism hastens to maturity, to sacrifice itself to the task of reproduction. From the spider who is eaten up by the female who he has just fertilized, or the wasp that devotes itself to gathering food for offspring it will never see, to the man who wears himself to ruin in the effort to feed and clothe and educate his children. Reproduction is the ultimate purpose of every organism, and its strongest instinct. For only so can the will conquer death. And to ensure the conquest of death, the will to reproduce is placed almost entirely beyond control of knowledge or reflection. Even a philosopher occasionally has children. The will shows itself here as independent of knowledge, and works blindly as an unconscious nature. Accordingly, the reproductive organs are properly the focus of will, and form the opposite pole to the brain, which is the representative of knowledge. The former are the life-sustaining principle. They ensure endless life. For this reason they were worshipped by the Greeks in the phallus, and by the Hindus in the lingam. Hesiod and Pharmides said very significantly that Eros is the first, the creator, the principle from which all things proceed. The relation of the sexes is really the invisible central point of all action and conduct, and peeps out everywhere in spite of all veils thrown over it. It is the cause of war and the end of peace, the basis of what is serious and the aim of the jest, the inexhaustible source of wit, the key of all allusions, and the meaning of all mysterious hints. We see it at every moment seat itself as the true and hereditary lord of the world, out of the fullness of its own strength, upon the ancestral throne, and looking down thence with scornful glance laugh at the preparations made to bind it, or imprison it, or at least limit it, and wherever possible keep it concealed, and even so to master it, that it shall only appear as a subordinate secondary concern of life. The metaphysics of love revolves around this subordination of the father to the mother, of the parent to the child, of the individual to the species. And first, the law of sexual attraction is that the choice of mate is to a large extent determined, however unconsciously, by mutual fitness to procreate. Each seeks a mate that will neutralize his defects, lest they be inherited. A physically weak man will seek a strong woman. Each one will especially regard as beautiful in another individual those perfections which he himself lacks, nay, even those imperfections which are the opposite of his own. The physical qualities of two individuals can be such that for the purpose of restoring as far as possible the type of species, the one is quite specially and perfectly the completion and supplement of the other, which therefore desires it exclusively. The profound consciousness with which we consider and ponder every part of the body, the critical scrupulosity with which we look at a woman who begins to please us. The individual here acts, without knowing it, by order of something higher than himself. Every individual loses attraction for the opposite sex, in proportion as he or she is removed from the fittest period for begetting or conceiving. Youth without beauty has still always attraction. Beauty without youth has none. That in every case of falling in love, what alone is looked to is the production of an individual of a definite nature is primarily confirmed by the fact that the essential matter is not the reciprocation of love, but possession. Nevertheless, no unions are so unhappy as these love marriages, and precisely for the reason that their aim is the perpetuation of the species, and not the pleasures of the individual. He who marries from love must live in sorrow, runs a Spanish proverb. Half the literature of the marriage problem is stupefied because it thinks of marriage as mating instead of thinking of it as an arrangement for the preservation of the race. Nature does not seem to care whether the parents are happy forever afterwards, or only for a day, so long as reproduction is achieved. Marriages of convenience arranged by the parents of the mates are often happier than marriages of love. Yet the woman who marries for love against the advice of her parents is in a sense to be admired, for she has preferred what is of most importance, and has acted in the spirit of nature, more exactly of the species, while the parents advised of the spirit of individual egoism. Love is the best energies. No, love is the best eugenics. Sorry. Since love is a deception practiced by nature, marriage is the attraction of love and must be disillusioning. Only a philosopher can be happy in marriage, and philosophers do not marry. Because the passion depended upon an illusion which represented that which has value only for the species as valuable for the individual, the deception must vanish after the attainment of the end of the species. The individual discovers that he has been the dupe of the species. If Petrarch's passion had been gratified, his song would have been silenced. The subordination of the individual to the species as instrument of its continuance appears again in the apparent dependence of individual vitality on the condition of the reproductive cells. The sexual impulse is to be regarded as the inner life of the tree, the species, upon which the life of the individual grows. Like a leaf that is nourished by the tree and assists in nourishing the tree, this is why that impulse is so strong and springs from the depths of our nature. To castrate an individual means to cut him off from the tree of the species upon which he grows, and thus severed leave him to wither. Hence the degradation of his mental and physical powers. That the service of the species, i.e. fecundation, 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 is followed in the case of every animal individual by momentary exhaustion and debility of all the powers, and in the case of most insects indeed by speedy death, on account of which Sallust said, Semininus emitio est partis animae jecture, that in the case of man, the extinction of the generative power shows that the individual approaches death, that excessive use of this power at every age shortens life, while on the other hand, temperance in this respect increases all the powers, and especially the muscular powers, on which account it was part of the training of the Greek athletes that the same restraint lengthens the life of the insect even to the following spring. All this points to the fact that the life of the individual is at bottom only borrowed from that of the species. Procreation is the highest point, and after attaining to it, the life of the first individual quickly or slowly sinks, while a new life ensures ensures to nature the endurance of the species, and repeats the same phenomena. Thus the alteration of death and reproduction is as the pulse beat of the species. Death is for the species what sleep is for the individual. This is nature's great doctrine of immortality. For the whole world, with all its phenomena, is the objectivity of the one indivisible will. The idea which is related to all other ideas as harmony is related to the single voice. In Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe, Goethe says, "Our spirit is a being of a nature quite indestructible, and its activity continues from eternity to eternity. It is like the sun, which seems to set only to our earthly eyes, but which in reality never sets, but shines on unceasingly." Goethe has taken the simile for me, not I for him. Okay. Only in space and time do we seem to be separate beings. They constitute the principle of individualization, which divides life into distinct organisms as appearing in different places or periods. Space and time are the veil of Maya, illusion hiding the unity of things. In reality, there is only the species, only life, only will. To understand clearly that the individual is only the phenomenon, not the thing in itself, to see in the constant change of matter, the fixed permanence of form, this is the essence of philosophy. The motto of history should run, Idan sed eliter. The more things change, the more they remain the same. He to whom men and all things have not at all times appeared as mere phantoms or illusions has no capacity for philosophy. The true philosophy of history lies in perceiving that, in all the endless changes and motley complexity of events, it is only this self-sane, unchangeable being that is before us, which today pursues the same ends as it did yesterday and ever will. The historical philosopher has accordingly to recognize the identical character in all events, and in spite of all the variety of special circumstances, of costumes and manners and customs, has to see everywhere the same humanity. To have read Herodotus is, from a philosophical point of view, to have studied enough history. Throughout and everywhere, the true symbol of nature is the circle, because it is the schema or type of recurrence. We like to believe that all history is a halting and imperfect preparation for the magnificent era of which we are the salt and summit. But this notion of progress is mere conceit and folly. In general, the wise in all ages have always said the same things, and the fools, who at all times form the immense majority, have in their way too acted alike and done the opposite. And so it will continue. For as Voltaire says, we shall leave the world as foolish and wicked as we found it. In the light of all this, we get a new and grimmer sense of the inescapable reality of determinism. Spinoza says, Epistle 62, that if a stone which has been projected through the air had consciousness, it would believe that it was moving of its own free will. I add to this only that the stone would be right. The impulse given it is for the stone what the motive is for me, and what in the stone appears as cohesion, gravitation, rigidity, is in its inner nature the same as that which I recognize in myself as will, and what the stone also, if knowledge were given to it, would recognize as will. But in neither the stone nor the philosopher is the will free. Will as a whole is free, for there is no other no other will beside it that could limit it. But each part of the universal will, each species, each organism, each organ, is irrevocably determined by the whole. Everyone believes himself a priori to be perfectly free, even in his individual actions, and thinks that at every moment he can commence another manner of life, which just means that he can become another person. But a posteriori, through experience, he finds to his astonishment that he is not free, but subjected to necessity, that in spite of all his resolutions and reflections he does not change his conduct, and that from the beginning of his life to the end of it, he must carry out the very character which he himself condemns, and as it were play the part which he has undertaken to the very end. Yep. Chapter 5. The world as evil. But if the world is will, it must be a world of suffering. First, because will itself indicates want, and its grasp is always greater than its reach. For every wish that is satisfied, there remain 10 that are denied. Desire is infinite, fulfillment is limited. It is like the alms thrown to a beggar, that keeps him alive today in order that his misery may be prolonged tomorrow. As long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires with their constant hopes and fears, so long as we are subject to willing, we can never have lasting happiness or peace. And fulfillment never satisfies. Nothing is so fatal to an ideal as its realization. The satisfied passion oftener leads to unhappiness than to happiness, for its demands often conflict so much with the personal welfare of him who is concerned that they undermine it. Each individual bears within himself a disruptive contradiction. The realized desire develops a new desire, and so on endlessly. At bottom, this results from the fact that the will must live on itself, for there exists nothing besides it, and it is a hungry will. In every individual, the measure of the pain essential to him was determined once for all by his nature, a measure which could neither remain empty nor be more than filled. If a great and pressing care is lifted from our breast, another immediately replaces it, the whole material of which was already there before, but could not come into consciousness as care because there was no capacity left for it. But now that there is room for this, it comes forward and occupies the throne. Again, life is evil because pain is its basic stimulus, and reality and pleasure is merely a negative cessation of pain. Aristotle was right. The wise man seeks not pleasure, but freedom from care and pain. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is, in reality and essence, negative only. We are not properly conscious of the blessings and advantages we actually possess, nor do we prize them, but think of them merely as a matter of course, for they gratify us only negatively, by restraining suffering. Only when we have lost them do we become sensible of their value. For the want, the privation, the sorrow, is the positive thing, communicating itself directly to us. What was it that led the cynics to repudiate pleasure in any form, if it was not the fact that pain is, in a greater or less degree, always bound up with pleasure. The same truth is contained in that fine French proverb, le menu, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, leave well enough alone. Look it up in French. Life is evil. I agree with that. Because as soon as want and suffering permit rest to a man, ennui is at once so near that he necessarily requires diversion, i.e. more suffering. Even if the socialist utopia were attained, innumerable evils would be left, because some of them, like strife, are essential to life. And if every evil were removed, and strife were altogether ended, boredom would become as intolerable as pain. So life swings like a pendulum, backward and forward between pain and ennui. After man has transformed all pains and torments into the conception of hell, there remained nothing for heaven except ennui. The more successful we become, the more we are bored. As want is the constant scourge of the people, so ennui is the scourge of the fashionable world. In middle-class life, ennui is represented by the Sundays and want by the weekdays. Life is evil because the higher the organism, the greater the suffering. And I think we'll stop there for part 3. See you in part 4.